I am based at RMIT University with the Aquatic Environmental Stress Research Group, and my background is as a aquatic ecotoxicologist. And tonight, I'm really excited to introduce you all to a fairly new project that we have, which is focused on examining contaminant trends and their potential risks in our estuaries and bays. Now, before I do get into my presentation, I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands and waters where this project does take place. And I recognise their enduring connection to and care for these environments over countless generations. I'd also like to extend my appreciation out to the many researchers, industry partners, community groups, and the dedicated volunteers that contribute to this project and make it all possible. So tonight, I'd like to begin by introducing you to the concept of contaminants. Now, these are substances that are either man-made or naturally occurring that become contaminants when they end up in places they shouldn't be, such as our waterways, or when they are present at levels that could pose a risk to human or environmental health. Now, contaminants originate from the thousands of chemicals produced and used in our everyday lives, with many new chemicals continually being developed. Now, any of these can make their way into our waterways, and that's where they then become contaminants. And some examples of those are what I've got listed here. So things like pesticides, heavy metals, PFAS, and also things like excess nutrients. Now, contaminants, as Kate also mentioned, are often an unseen threat. So we can't always detect them with the naked eye. And unlike more obvious pollution, such as things like oil spills, which we can see, or surfactant foams, most contaminant pollution really goes unnoticed. And in this slide, what I've got here are some examples of some of our samplers that have been deployed out in the water. And at first glance, you might kind of look at them and you might assume that one that's on the left that's really heavily biofouled, it's covered in barnacles, comes from maybe a dirtier or more contaminated site, compared to that really clean looking one on the right. However, this biofouling could actually indicate that local species are really thriving in that environment and they're able to colonize the area, while the clean sampler kind of suggests that there might be something going on at that site where species may not be thriving so much, and that could reflect that at that location there might be some contaminants present in the water. I'm going to talk about these samplers a little bit more throughout my presentation, and how we can also look at observations like this, along with measuring for the contaminants to understand impacts of contaminants in our estuaries and bays. So why do we care about contaminants in our estuaries and bays? So our bays and estuaries are much more than just scenic locations. They're really vibrant ecosystems, and they support things like tourism, fishing, recreation, and community well-being. But they also hold significant ecological, social, cultural, and economic value. So it makes them some of our most treasured natural assets. However, these ecosystems are facing increasing pressure from things like urbanisation, population growth, and climate change. And all these factors are also often contribute to contaminant pollution. And so when contaminants enter our estuaries and bays, they can degrade water quality, they can harm marine life, and they can impact on all those values that these areas have. So to safeguard these systems, it's really essential that we understand where contaminants might come from, how they travel there, and the risks that they might present. And so that's where our Exploring Unseen Threat program comes in. So this initiative focuses on monitoring surface waters for contaminants at multiple estuary sites across our 2 bays, and we're screening for over 40,000 contaminants. And this is the first time this sort of amount of contaminants have ever been screened for. Our sampling takes place 3 times a year and all run over a 3-year period, and we're just sort of finishing our first year. And this will enable us to identify both spatial and temporal trends in contaminant occurrence. Some of the monitoring rounds will also include some toxicological assessments. So this is where we look at potential impacts to flora and fauna. So we'll sort of end up with some data on the occurrence of contaminants in these systems and also whether they're potentially having an effect. And by collecting this information, what the project aims to do is establish a baseline of contaminants of concern in both Port Phillip and Western Port estuaries and within the Bay. And this is a really important step towards more informed management and the long-term protection of these ecosystems. Now, how do we do this sampling and monitoring? So as I mentioned, we're focusing on surface waters, and what we're using are these special samplers called passive samplers, and you can see them in these little pictures here. And what we're doing is we're working with volunteers to deploy these samplers out into our estuaries and bays. The samplers go out for around 1 month, and during that time they accumulate the contaminants onto them from the water. After that period, our volunteers go back out and retrieve them. They send, or we then go and pick them up from them, and they're taken to our analytical labs, which is the National Measurement Institute in Port Melbourne, and that's where the scientists then extract the contaminants off them and screen for their presence. And we're using 2 different screening approaches. One called a targeted approach, and this is where we have a list of around 450 contaminants that we've developed over many, many years that we potentially think might be present. So we compare against them. And then we have this non-targeted screening. So this is where we compare these spectra, which are shown here in the slide, to these libraries of spectra for 40,000 contaminants. And that's a lot more complicated and produces a lot of data, but it gives us a broader understanding of contaminant presence. So what kind of data do we get from this work? So the approach provides presence-absence data on the types of contaminants found in our estuaries and bays. And the data that I'm showing here is from our first round of sampling, which was done December last year to January this year. And this is the results from that targeted screening. So we screened for 450 contaminants, and we detected 104 across our sites. The detected contaminants were grouped from a range of categories of contaminants, which are shown down below there in the water. What we found were pesticides were the most prevalent of the chemicals or chemical contaminants that we detected. So they made up 86% of all detections, with herbicides being the most common, followed by our fungicides and insecticides. But we also detected some pharmaceuticals, industrial compounds, and some synergists. So they're things that work with other chemicals. One thing with these detections, we're not saying that pesticides are the most common overall detected. The targeted screening we have is very focused on pesticides. So many of the chemicals making up that 450 that we look at are pesticides. As we undertake that non-targeted screening, we'll be broadening out to look at contaminants from other wider groups. So we'll hopefully uncover a wider diversity of things that might be occurring in these systems. We also gather information on spatial differences in contaminant numbers across the different estuaries. And this map is just showing the numbers of contaminants that we found at our different estuary sites in that first round. So we found anything from down near sort of 7 or 8 contaminants all the way through to low 30s at any one site. Now, when we look at these numbers of contaminants and where they're occurring, we can start to look at potential sources of the contaminants. And we can also identify catchments where maybe we want to go and do further work because we're seeing a lot of different things occurring in them. So, for example, we've done some initial work on this data where we've looked at the relationship between land use and the presence of contaminants. And so what we've sort of found is that there's several sites where there was really high contaminant counts, and these were linked to catchments that were dominated by intensive agriculture or intensive industrial activities. And in contrast, we then had some catchments which are characterised primarily by things like rural living or residential areas, and these showed lower numbers of contaminants. So I just want to sort of sum up why this project is really important. And, you know, despite there being quite a bit of research that's done on contaminant risks in our estuaries and bays, there are still important knowledge gaps that remain. And this program is really starting to improve our monitoring in these systems and helping address those knowledge gaps. We're still in the very early stages. As I said, we've just finished 1 year. So we've just got our third round of samplers gone out just recently. We are developing a baseline of contaminant presence and a limited understanding of impact. And as we move forward, things in the future we'll be able to direct is where we might want to now go and understand the concentrations of contaminants so we can really inform risk assessment better. The initial findings highlight that there are a variety of contaminants, and that ongoing non-target screening will broaden our understanding of the types of contaminants that are of greatest concern. The research is really vital as contaminants arise from our everyday activities and they can affect the values of our estuaries and bays. So understanding where and how they're coming in and where they're occurring, that'll help us develop targeted management strategies. And the last important thing with this is like building strong partnerships is really essential for projects like this to ensure that our findings are used by the different stakeholders. So that's anywhere from community through to government and industry. Our volunteer participation is really key to this project. It helps us to do more sampling because it reduces the costs of the program, but it also provides that opportunity for community to play a role in protecting these ecosystems. So I hope I've given you a little snapshot into our project. I'd like to thank you all for listening. If you do want to get involved, you can use the QR code or head to our website and you can sign up, and then you can participate in sampling events in your local estuary. You can also visit our website and there's reports and recordings of seminars we've given on the results of the project, so you can go and get them from there, or even check out some of the training material which would inform you on what's involved if you want to participate. But yeah, thanks guys.
Everyone's everyone's clapping at home, Jackie. I can hear it from where I am. Can you hear me quite okay? Good. I had to put on my helicopter pilot headphones. Apparently, there's some reverb coming through. Uh, yeah, thanks for, I guess, what's like just scratching the surface of what we sort of know. We've got a few questions in and around. There's one here about, is there any possibility of extending the program to Geelong and the Ballerine?
We do go as far as Hovels Creek
Yep.
at the moment, which is sort of Lara and comes into the top of Corio Bay. We haven't moved further down the coast at this point. It's more the main estuaries that are entering Port Phillip Bay.
Yeah. But as you're saying, so if community are interested in being
Yeah,
involved,
as part of the project, we're sort of a little bit limited to where the Port Phillip Bay fund. So this is funded through the Port Phillip Bay Fund.
yep.
So we're a little bit limited by where that allows us to do work. We are looking at trying to expand the program by applying for some more funding, which would let us look at a few contaminants that we can't look at in this because they're really particular and the way they're analysed. But at this stage, it'll probably still stay in Western Port and within the Port Phillip Bay areas.